Usually in real life, when I talk about these things, I used to only respond to people who actively make the world a difficult place. People who actively spread misinformation and bigotry. And I would have wanted to avoid further drama by not digging a bit deeper into the issue. But today I can't help but to edit this in a little more progressive fashion when my next interviewee brought up something so infuriating, so I had to get in on the action. Anyway, hi everyone. I know it's been a while. Thanks again for the feedback on my first two videos. My next interview is with Eric, an old friend of mine from university, whom I was acquainted with in the Filipino-American Student Association. I started off the discussion with current politics because Eric became incredibly passionate over the years, so I figured I can learn a lot from him, and so can a lot of people, frankly. What was the issue he brought up that grinded my gears, you might ask? Well, you will see once we get there.
A lot of times the parties kind of choose their sides on a stance based solely on agenda and less on human value, and that's kind of the the reason why we should do away with the two-party system is because it starts to be more about who has more power versus whether or not people are being taken care of. I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a Democrat or a Republican, but so far as to call myself like I'm a political human being because I engage in politics through my actions, through my words, and I'm not the kind of person anymore to shy away from those conversations. I actually quite enjoy them. So
I asked them why people would be turned off by politics, even if they seem passionate about certain issues, and why some people couldn't grasp the issues in general.
and this is also a sentiment that I've carried with me for quite a while now. And I think if you're able to say like I'm tired of politics, I don't really want to engage in that right now. I think there's definitely a sense of privilege that comes with that. If you can kind of disengage from the world at large at any moment, um, and it doesn't affect you in like a profound way, I think that makes it shows how much privilege you have. It shows that you can turn off your screen, go to your kind of relatively normal, secure life, and not worry about the effect that politics, so to speak, has on your life. The people that they see in the Senate, in the House, in even in the White House, don't represent their views as a whole, and that's what they don't want to engage with. Like these are the visual representations of who's supposed to be representing them, but it doesn't click like that. Like that person just couldn't possibly understand how I feel, like as an Asian American, as a Filipino American, as a as a Black American. Like that person doesn't have my lived experience. So how could they possibly attempt to represent me, thousands or millions of people that look like me, right? That's the disconnect. It's not the fact that politics is difficult to handle or digest. It's the fact that the people representing us for the country, you know, can't, or like they try to, but they literally can't represent our lived experience or replicate our lived experience. So
I noticed that when it comes to identity politics, people would address issues only when it affects them. I asked them whether oppression is identity based, like certain issues only affecting black people, for instance, and why other people can't seem to relate.
only like namely because I mean oppression is identity based, but it's also based in based in systems. It's not so it is based on identity, but the thing that creates and influences those identities are the systems. So you have classes of people in the country. That is a direct effect of you know tax brackets, minimum wage, income restrictions, housing, redlining. All of those things are systemic and they have a direct effect on the identity of people. Um, but I will also say that identity is something that um, it is something that we carry, but it's also something that's perceived as well. And I think that in regards to like, I guess my experiences around racism and systemic oppression, uh, I definitely acknowledge that there's a heavy amount of privilege on my part. I'm a cisgendered um, a cisgendered straight male who is not BIPOC. So I don't identify as a black or indigenous person of color. That's what the term BIPOC stands for. Now,
Okay.
BIPOCs in America and the world around endure heavy oppression, not just based on their identity, not just based on systems, but it's like it's historical and it's ingrained. So like if you look at studies even as far as back as like the 16 or 1700s, there's like this idea of associating darker skin with less morals or with a lack of knowledge or a lack it's definitely something that's permeated um, culture for hundreds of years. um, so for me, there is a lot that I have had to come to terms with, especially over quarantine, in terms of my privilege that I can be heard in a space over women. I can be heard in a space over other black people. I can be heard in a space over even other kinds of Asian people. There are Asians that are discriminated against more than my Asian, which is to say darker, like East Indian or Middle Eastern. These are all Asian races of people that tend to experience a different or somewhat heavier kind of oppression than Filipino-Americans do. Um, I think a lot of the difficulty with Filipinos and Filipino-Americans, and I was actually just talking to one of my mentors about this the other day, is that there is a tendency to approach toxic positivity with Filipinos, and that they love to avoid conflict, but they also love to watch it happen. So there's this kind of like love-hate relationship with conflict. Like they love, there's that saying like chismosa. They love gossip. They love, that little like micro drama. Then when it comes to stuff that's like huge and stressful, they hate talking about it. You'd be hard pressed to find anyone from like our parents or grandparents' generation that would be comfortable talking about race for longer than 10 to 15 minutes, um, even as it pertains to them as people.
So, what is the deal with Filipinos coming to America who are put off by their own history, and why do they quickly disengage?
What you also need to kind of remember is that for the most part, people who leave the Philippines to come to America are looking for a better life. There is a high rate of crime, high rate of poverty. Uh, there's religious genocide happening in the Philippines. There's corrupt government, drugs apparently. I haven't been back to the Philippines in a long time, but I try to keep up. Duterte is approaching a dictatorship in terms of how he runs the country. So a lot of
Yeah.
people are leaving, to find better. And for the most part, what they find is better. A lot of times, um, we as people, and this is across the board, this isn't just restricted to Filipinos, is we will trade our oppression for another as long as it's of lesser value. Like as long as it's not like
Uh,
higher
okay.
oppression, we'll trade
Okay.
because we're convinced that it's more valuable, so therefore it's okay, right? Filipino Americans also like they also are discriminated against. We also experience, you know, all kinds of things. There's ableism, there's ageism, there's classism, there is racism towards Filipino Americans because there's a lack of knowledge as to our geography and as to our history. Um, that most people don't know how kind of crucial our participation in World War II was. A lot of people don't, understand the contributions of early Filipino Americans to the building of certain infrastructures in America. They kind of dismiss us as just sort of like we look like Hispanics and we just are here, but we're from some weird group of islands in the Pacific. There's a lack of knowledge there, but that also isn't attributed to their ignorance only. It's also attributed to our lack of a desire to address where we come from. We don't like to talk about all of the horrors that Filipinos have, gone through over the past 400 or 500 years. You probably won't find a culture night that talks about the Spanish Crusades. You probably won't find a culture night that talks about the assimilation of indigenous tribes into,
Right.
into larger mainstream Western culture. You won't find a culture night that talks about the conflict between Muslims and Christians in the Philippines. They would rather see it as something they outran, outgrew, um, completely cut off, and built themselves back up from new. rather than as something that was essentially an integral like part of their identity. Our parents or even our parents grandparents would probably kind of loathe the way that Filipino Americans treated their culture, because there's a lot of suffering that came about. You're seeing a lot more self-awareness and engagement now because we don't really have a choice in terms of like finding our identity. There's a lot more sitting at home with yourself. There's a lot more introspection, which is probably one of the few arguments I have for COVID being a good thing for this country, is that it has a lot of it forced a lot of introspection on us. When all of this stuff with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and everyone else started coming to light, my dad was kind of like, because my auntie didn't want to hear anything about it. She didn't want to believe that it was the fault of Trump's America, which I wholeheartedly believe that it has been. I'm not saying that this racial injustice only started happening when Trump came into the presidency. I think it just made racists braver. But this is subconsciously ingrained. And Filipino Americans have a tendency to want to just kind of stay put and keep growing, rather than like be really neighborly and reach across the aisle and be like, hey, look, there's an issue that we have to fix as a community. I don't know if you had heard, this is probably the most pertinent example. A group of white men decided to open up a upscale wine bar restaurant in DC called Barkada, which, as you know, that's a group of friends in Tagalog. They have no association with any Filipino food on the menu. There are no Filipinos that I know of in upper management on the staff. It's simply appropriation of a name for marketing benefit. It sounds cool. We can give you a cool like translation of what this means, but nowhere else in our brand is it associated with Philippine culture.
I was curious as to what these Filipinos were waffling about. I wanted to make sure I grasped the context clearly. What I found to be troubling was not so much the appropriation of the name itself, but the backlash against the backlash behind it. There are many articles on the controversy documenting opinions made by both Filipinos and Filipino-Americans. There was a push to get the hipster mayonnaise foursome to change the name of their restaurant, and so far, on the 2nd of August, a Change.org petition was made asking the owners not to change their name. Not sure if there has been any change since then, so if any of you know, as of now, you can comment down below if anything has happened yet. Now, to save myself the insanity, I'm only going to give a quick rundown of what happened and what really drove me off the wall. A woman by the name of Jessica Malete addressed this issue on social media, and in response, a woman by the name of Ella Page created a petition to have the owners not change their name. By the way, the celebrity I referenced just changed her name to Elliot. Actually, I just found this out in post-production. Anyway, so Ella claims that the word Barkada is not a trademark, therefore anyone can use it and be proud of it. She goes on to say that the owners of the restaurant were bullied into changing their name and that not one person represents all Filipinos. Now, what does she mean by that? Who are the majority and who exactly agreed? Who gets to decide who represents all Filipinos? I don't think any non-black individual or group would dare to take the name Black Panthers because it is not trademarked. And who exactly is jealous? Also, I just want to point out that her grammar is incredibly horrible here, but I digress. Another issue I have with this discourse, moving on to another article, is how many of these proud Filipinos are very quick to bash the backlash, calling them snowflakes and just being woke. This rhetoric is very common with many right-wing pundits, the kind of language I'm sure some of you are familiar with on the internet. And just as this article points out, the experience of living as a Filipino in the Philippines is not the same as living as a Filipino elsewhere. Speaking as a Filipino-American myself, I agree. Having to see the dominant culture here growing up in a white-dominated area, it is not abrasive to be using white heteronormative words and names. Just as the article states, the Americans and British don't feel particularly aggrieved when we use their names. But it's not the same, Ella. In the same article written by Nana Ozaeta, the 4 new white kids on the block did issue an apology via their social media. Nana calmly addressed both sides of the issue and actually spoke to people who gave it more thought. And like Nana, they came to the conclusion that this is something worthy to address because, again, it is not the owners that they have a beef with. It is that Filipinos are very quick to put down criticisms about an issue that's solely in Western culture, not in the Philippines. Ella. But of course, people like Ella Page decide to become Barkada apologists, saying things like, is it a requirement to have Filipino food if you use a Filipino word to name a bar? I am Filipino, and I like the name Barkada. Filipino here and not offended. We Filipinos, actual Filipinos, do not have any problem whatsoever with your name, tisk tisk tisk. But see, this misses the point. And I know what some of you are thinking. Well, what about Goldilocks? What about Olive Garden? Are those not appropriations of European culture? Well, just like Eric, this is what I have a problem with Filipino society. We tend to look up to the West as the ideal model when they decide to appropriate our customs. But when we decide to appropriate theirs, we are the customers, not the creators. Ella. As Eric explained, Barkada features absolutely no association with Filipino culture, or even pretends to be. At least Taco Bell pretends to be Mexican. So if you're going to justify appropriation, you may as well do it right. Hell, the company of Olive Garden has culinary chefs being trained in Italy to emulate Italian food. And I would know because I used to work there. Now, I couldn't tell you what political leaning these people have. I'm not psychic. I don't know what they secretly believe. Furthermore, I don't actually care. I doubt any of these views would indoctrinate anyone to either side, but they tend to really love being centrist or neutral, and as Eric said, likes to avoid conflict, where extremes on both sides of the aisle are viewed as equivalent. And this goes for both Filams and Filipinos, who are admittedly not so keen on these issues. I don't expect them to all the time. In a way, they want the same thing, only that the key difference is Filipinos who are pretty keen on these things, who are pretty keen on how these hegemonic forces seek to control who gets to own a culture's name. And that would be the Filipinos who speak the loudest, which understandably can be intimidating to those who wish to remain hospitable, kind, sweet, caring, humble. You know, the model minority. Ugh. Ironically, I can list many examples in which a lot of Filipino-American families, as well as other Asians, have been targets of harassment or passive racial insults. But that is for another video. Anyways, truth be told, Eric had actually explained most of this beforehand. I was just getting ahead of myself.
Jessica Milete, who actually was, way back in the day, she did like regional direction stuff for Find. But she works at NPR, and she like petitioned. She had a petition going to get them to change their name because like you're appropriating at this point. What happened next was I can only describe as like super annoying. Is we had a group of Filipinos start commenting her and DMing her and saying, "You don't represent us. This is recognition and acknowledgement for us as Filipinos."
What?
Yeah. And they were like, you're just being a Karen. They literally called her that. They were like, you're being a Filipino Karen. We think it's really cool that they have this name. It's incredibly surface level, and that surface level understanding also comes from a lack of ability to process the greater picture. And that ability is only going to be enhanced when we start having more conversations openly about what's happening around us and really acknowledging how much it affects us as people, because it affects us a lot. It really hammers home the kinds of stuff that that we have to deal with on a regular basis. You might not feel it. You might not feel like racism affects you, but it really does. Like, if it's kind of that whole mentality of like, if they can do that to black people, they can do it to any other group. And up until a few years ago, it has worked that way. The reason why there is so much unrest, the reason why there is so much violence, the reason why there is so much, fighting against, having a return, people wanting to return back to normal, is because people are starting to wake up and realize, oh, normal's not good. Normal basically puts a whole system of people and policies on top of our necks. Like, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to go into some anti-racism literature. How to Be an Anti-Racist is one of the best books I've ever started reading. I'm still slowly processing it. I'm about halfway through, and I'm going to start reading Algorithms of Oppression. It basically details the way that the digital age has become a vehicle for, white cisgendered policy, not necessarily people, but policy, to overrun everything else, because it becomes ingrained in search engines. It becomes ingrained in the way that we are delivered our content, because as much as we want to think, oh, those are controlled by machines or blah, 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 those machines are designed by people. More often than not, the people that design them are white men in power, white women in power, white passing people in power. There's one thing I would say is that we, as Filipinos, I think we owe it to ourselves to sort of acknowledge how much privilege we have and use that privilege to engage in spaces where other people might not be able to, and fight for them. That's the reason, one of the reasons why I'm so tireless in my activism, is because I know I don't have to worry necessarily about running on the street. I know I don't have to worry about walking. I know I don't have to worry about, being spoken over. I don't have to worry about, there's literally 100 things, even just as a cisgendered male, that I don't have to worry about. I'm not black. There's another 1,000 things I don't have to worry about. Knowing those things and acknowledging those things allow me to keep my fight going on for longer. I can talk it up for as long as I need to, because I know that I don't really have an excuse to be tired, because I'm not experiencing the same kind of emotional trauma, mental trauma, physical trauma as black people are, as women are, as LGBTQ people are. And that's why I think it's important for people to just kind of like connect with their humanness and understand that what we're fighting for is not, we're not fighting for privilege. We're fighting for lives. We're fighting for people to be able to live their lives as people.
So, if you've made it this far of me waffling about, congratulations. You have come to the conclusion of the interview. I really needed to let that out of my system, because it really hammered home a lot of the issues that pertains to minorities other than black people within the past decade. As people are starting to realize what's going on, as Eric said. So what can we do about this as we also try to take care of ourselves? And do you have any last thoughts before we close?
I think what I do want to sort of like leave you and everybody else with is that it's really important to, well, for one, take care of yourself before you engage in these things. Mind your research, mind your knowledge, mind your rhetoric. But at the same time, once you do engage in this arena, keep in mind that what you're fighting for is more than just a group of people, or or one person, or the death of one person. It sounds cliche, but you're basically fighting for like a change in the human race. You're if you operate with that mindset, everything you do and you say will have a little bit more weight and meaning behind it. Don't think about it as I'm being political. You have to think about it as I'm being a warrior for change. I would say just operate with kindness, like always. Just think about other people, think about their struggles, think about what they might have to go through or not able to access on a given day. And I think that will help moving forward, because even when it comes to how I treat white people or other people, I also need to operate out of kindness, because at the end of the day, one thing we can all unite against is that it's not people that are the problem, it's policies, it's the system. And that's what we have to make change to.
So please share, like, and subscribe, and all that jazz. Share your thoughts. Let me know of your comments, questions, rage. At least now you know what's in the minds of passionate people like Eric and I. No thanks to some